Today we're going to discuss different types of poetry. Before we begin though, I want to cover some terminology. There's some words I use that you may not be familiar with. First of all, rhyme. When we talk about rhyme, in general, it just means similar sounds at the ends of words that are close together. When we talk about a rhyme scheme in a poem, however, it's basically a set pattern of rhymed words at the end of lines. A stanza is kind of like a paragraph in prose. It marks separate ideas in poetry, and it's indicated with a blank line. Literary devices are any technique that writers use to make their writing more interesting. Figurative language is an example of this. It's words and phrases that don't have their everyday meaning, words that you exaggerate or don't mean literally. We're going to cover two main types of poetry, also called styles or genres of poetry, as well as an other category. The two styles are lyric and narrative. Lyric poetry is intense and emotional. It focuses on thought and emotion, and it can have a sort of song-type quality. Some examples of lyric poetry are an elegy. An elegy is a poem about mourning, often mourning the death of a person, but not always. It doesn't have a set meter or rhyme scheme. An ode is a poem that's addressed to a particular person, event, or thing. Often, the point of an ode is to praise that thing and to show how great it is. Again, although it does have a rhyme scheme, it doesn't have a required one. The sonnet is one of the most complex and stylized forms of a lyric poem. There's two main types, Petrarchan and Shakespearean. Both have 14 lines and strict rules about meter and rhyme scheme, but they have different rules. Most sonnets are about love. The definition of narrative poetry, though, is pretty straightforward. Narrative poetry tells a story. There's two major types that we're going to talk about, and that's an epic, a very long poem that tells a story about heroes or heroic events like wars or challenging dragons. It's usually written in a particular meter and rhyme scheme, although the meter and rhyme scheme can vary from poem to poem. The second type is the ballad. A ballad generally tells the story of some event that's very interesting to the society, often something like a crime. They were originally intended to be sung while people danced. Because of this, each poem has a meter and a rhyme scheme, although, again, they may be different from one ballad to the next. Some of the other types of poetry that we're going to explore are the haiku, a Japanese poem. It's a short poem that connects nature to human nature. Often it's written in 3 lines with 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and then 5 syllables. Free verse is poetry on almost any topic and has no set meter or rhyme scheme. It's probably the easiest type of poetry to write because it's so, well, free. Next we have the parody, and I wanted to talk about this because they're pretty popular right now. Parody, and it's not just in terms of poetry or songs, although we're talking about it that way in particular, uh, imitates the style of usually a well-known song or poem to make people laugh. Finally, there's spoken word poetry, performance-based poetry. Often it's called slam poetry as well, although that's more a style of competition than it is a style of poem. Because the focus on spoken word poetry is the spoken word, it often contains elements of rap or hip-hop, storytelling, and theater. The focus is not just on the words, but also on the way that the poet says them. So why does this matter? Why do I want you to know these different styles of poetry? Well, for one, knowing the different styles of poetry can allow you to explore a variety of different styles to see which one fits you best. You can push yourself as a writer and a poet by looking at a single topic and then trying to write it in different types or styles of poetry. Finally, you can find examples of the types of poetry that most interest you and learn how to create them by reading them. As I've said before, I absolutely love poetry. It allows us to connect with each other emotionally because poetry is sharing the emotions that you feel for whatever your topic is. Poetry is way more intense than prose, and it often deals with subjects and topics that we find challenging or are difficult to think about. It comes from the deepest places within us, and that's why I love to write it.